Thank you all so much. I'm really glad to be here. I have about 8 years of stories and research and things to pack into this, so I'm going to move as quickly as I can. And I want you to know that all of the information, there will be links at the bottom of the screen. Feel free to take pictures. I'll make this publicly available for you. And I will stay after for questions if we, for some reason, don't have time for a question and answer session. So I've called this little presentation a daily dose of misinformation because they like to say a lot of the things I'm about to tell you is misinformation, but really I think it's just a lot of stuff that gets censored and misinterpreted and misrepresented. So with that being said, what you can expect from this is kind of 3 parts. I'm going to start with my story about why I started off being intending on vaccinating all of my children and then deciding not to, what that looked like. What was happening right before COVID and why I kind of knew exactly what was happening before it seemed like anyone else was waking up to it and how we responded to it, and now what I see coming next and why it's so important as we approach elections that we have this information in the back of our heads. So with that being said, as I said, I started my story about 8 years ago. I was pregnant with my first son. And how many of you guys have kids in the room? Okay, a decent amount. How many of you are in the dating world right now? Okay, nice. So, we have a lot of single friends, and we kind of chat with them about the differences between dating 10 years ago versus dating today. And when my husband and I were dating, we asked things like, do you believe in God? What are your politics? Do you want to have kids? Today they're going, are you vaccinated? Are we going to get vaccinated? Right, exactly. It's really no one's business, but it is kind of the conversation of the day. And I kind of wish we had talked about it first, because I'm pregnant, and we are having to sign forms with our midwife, and I'm realizing we don't agree on this. I am 100% planning on vaccinating my baby with whatever they tell me to, and he is completely dead set against it. And I'm asking my husband, well, why? And he's like, do you know what's in them? I'm like, well, do you know? And the truth was neither of us knew. But I had to go about proving to him how safe and necessary they were for our kids. And that's when my journey started. These are the things that I believed at that time. I believed that vaccines were safe and effective. I believed they saved lives. I believed that I turned out just fine. I was vaccinated and I'm all good. I believed that the risk was about 1 in a million chance of something going wrong. And I really thought that measles was like a major killer of children and that polio would come back. Specifically if my child didn't get vaccinated. I had this panic about it. Well, I don't think that these were necessarily fair things to believe at that time, and I quickly found that out. I'm curious, do we have anybody who was born in the 80s? Okay, 90s? Okay, all right, so just give me a guess here for those of you born in the 90s. I'm curious, do you know how many vaccines were on the schedule for kids back in the early 80s? When I was a kid, my vaccine is what I would have gotten, either how many or how many doses. Any guesses?
10.
10, okay.
2.
3.
All right, what about today? Any guesses on today?
14.
14.
14.
Okay, 14. Well, here they are, folks. When I was a kid, it was 7 vaccines spread out over 24 doses, most of them in the first 6 years of your life. Today, it is doubled. It is 16, spread out over between 69 and 86 doses, depending on if you get the flu vaccine once or twice per year. That's a huge difference. So my whole belief of I got vaccinated and I turned out fine doesn't necessarily stand up to today's standards, and I had to look into that. So the very first vaccine that I wanted to ask about was, what's the first one they want to give my baby? Well, they want to give my baby a sexually transmitted disease vaccine 12 hours after they're born. And I was like, I'm sorry, what? Say that again? Why is my baby going to be exposed to a sexually transmitted disease? Or through drug needle sharing. That's the other way that hepatitis B is transmitted. Well, none of this made any sense to me. But then I also found out, well, if I had hepatitis B, there's a chance I'd spread it to my baby. A 4% chance, if you go on the CDC website. A 4% chance that if I'm positive, I will share it with my baby. But we test for hepatitis B, and I tested negative. So why are we still giving it to 100% of babies? Well, the CDC will tell you 2 reasons. Number 1, it's a safety net in case they made a mistake. Okay, well, what else did they mistake about? It's also there because their studies show that if you get that first vaccine, you are more likely to do the whole schedule. That's it. That is why. They actually don't do this in other countries like Japan. They actually only give it to the baby if the mother tests positive for it as that safety net. So I found this all very interesting, and I kind of wanted to start asking more questions like, what if my kid is the 1 in a million who actually is injured? I have to go down that path of the what if, right? And I thought surely there would be lawsuits, and surely it'd be all over the news, and surely this is how we keep things safe, because that's how we keep everything safe, is through lawsuits and free market, and people have to fix it, right? Well, that's not the case, because back in 1986, because of all the lawsuits, Ronald Reagan signed into act, very reluctantly, into law, the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act, and it created two entities. One is what we call vaccine courts, and the other is VAERS, Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System. And what I found out from this was pretty disturbing, because in vaccine court, it's a no-fault court system, so there goes that liability. The manufacturers don't actually have to make the product better. It also means that even if you prove that it happened, in order to get the money, you have to sign something saying that they actually weren't at fault. So there's no pressure to make these products any safer than they were back then. Another problem is it takes 7 to 8 years for everything to go through the court system. So this started in '86, but we didn't start seeing the results of it for a long time. That's a problem. The other thing to know is that it's tax dollar funded. So, yay! Who's paying for it? We are. Now, the other thing to look at is the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System. And this is a very flawed system. So it's voluntary, and therefore less than 1% of actual adverse events are actually reported. Not only is it voluntary, but largely doctors don't know about it. From my experience talking with them, I've watched lots of doctors talk about their education on vaccines. Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System is not something that most people utilize, and it's a lot of paperwork. And so even if they did know about it, maybe they wouldn't deal with it. Well, this is how we keep our checks and balances, and that doesn't work so well. So, this is as of the end of January. We have 1.9 million adverse events reported so far, and that number represents less than 1%, just to give you an idea of what the actual events are. So my scope at this time of what is an adverse event looked like either a small fever and my arm hurts, or I have that freak anaphylactic shock and I die because I'm that 1 in a million. And I had no understanding of what all these adverse events are. Like, what do they look like? Well, has anybody seen the inside of a package insert on a vaccine? Okay, so a few of you have a little bit of an understanding. Sorry, I skipped ahead of one of my slides. Okay, that's okay. We're gonna go in this order. So the Vaccine Adverse Events Reporting System, thankfully, I'm gonna come back to the package inserts, but the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System, thankfully, Congress recognized that it was failing. In 2006, they gave $100 million to Harvard in a grant to fix it and make it automated. And what they would do is take the adverse events that I'll show you in a minute on the package inserts, and they put it into a computer system, and if someone gets vaccinated within a certain time frame, if one of these events occurs, it automatically gets reported, sends it back to the CDC, and the CDC would be able to collect that data. We'd find the correlation so we could find out where we should be looking for causation. Well, Harvard did a really great job. And what they discovered in over 715,000 patients with 1.4 million doses of 45 different vaccines was that there were 35,000 possible reactions, meaning 2.6% per dose. That's 1 in 38 doses. How many doses do we give to kids today? 1 in 89. Okay, so we're talking about 1 to 2 adverse events per child now. It's not 1 in a million. It's a lot worse than it used to be. So this was very shocking. The other thing that I find very sad is that unfortunately the CDC ghosted them. So we spent $100 million on a project that worked and the CDC just ignored their phone calls. The end of that. So this is the inside of a package insert, just a list of all of the things that you might find across the spectrum of them. If you go to justtheinserts.com, you can get access to every package insert. If you go to FDA's website, you can look at them. What you're going to find is the excipient list, which is like the ingredient list, what's inside the vaccine, as well as where you can find the studies that they use to get it FDA approved. Now, one of the things that's a problem with the studies that they have done, the CDC, the FDA, all of them say that it is unethical to withhold a vaccine from someone. So that means that they're not testing a vaccine against a saline solution placebo. They're oftentimes testing it just against a different vaccine. If you go into the MMR, for example, which is probably one of the biggest ones, and you look through and find where they did their safety test, it's measles against measles against measles. They just tried 3 different kinds of measles. They never tested it against a placebo. And this creates a problem because our gold standard of safety in all drugs and all pharmaceuticals is a double-blind placebo trial and over a long period of time. The hepatitis B vaccine, for example, was tested for a few days. That's it. And they're giving it to 100% of newborn babies 12 hours after they're born as a safety net. I mean, I was shocked. So this information, this was as far as I had scratched the surface on trying to prove to my husband how safe they are. And I was like, okay, I don't think I'm convinced of the safety right now. I think I need to dig a little deeper into how necessary they are. Because measles is deadly and I don't want polio to come back. And that was kind of where I was going. Now, I could go deep into all of them, but I'm just going to talk about these 2 and give you the ability to do some research yourself further. So let's look at measles. I'm so sorry. I skipped ahead on one of my slides again. Okay, so first let me go into a vaccinated versus unvaccinated study, and then we'll get into measles. So with the placebo and the unvaccinated versus vaccinated, well, at this time we have about 94% of the population is vaccinated. However, there are pockets of communities that are not. You've got Amish, you've got Orthodox Jew, you've got a lot of homeschool populations sprinkled around. So there have been a lot of studies exactly done on these populations, but the problem with them is you've got different gene pools, you've got different environmental factors. And so those studies are not always 100% reliable and they're difficult to happen. However, there was one doctor who finally published a study in 2020, and I was very excited to see this happen. I followed this doctor for a long time, and I just want to share a little of his story. So he had moms and dads who would vaccinate their first child all the way. They would vaccinate their second child, and they'd start doing it all the way. But they started seeing some of these problems with their kids. Behavioral issues, rashes, screaming, developmental delays, like banging their head on the floor, loss of eye contact, aggressive behavior, all kinds of things that were concerning, and it was timing out with the vaccines. And they went to the doctors and they said, could it be this? And they said, no, that's not it. But as this particular doctor out in Oregon, Dr. Thomas, was watching his patients, he started listening to the parents and decided that he would pay closer attention to it. He ended up developing a delayed schedule and pushing some of the vaccines back and withholding some of the ones that weren't a big deal. And he actually saw behavioral improvements and health improvements in his patients. And then he had those same families have a 3rd and a 4th baby, and they didn't get any vaccines. And he was able to actually do the unvaccinated versus vaccinated study within his own practice. So you've got same environment, same care, same family, same gene, all of those things. And these are his results. And what you will see on this is that you should expect after a wellness check with a vaccinated kid that you'll have a fever. That's super normal. This was one of the examples. I'd love for you guys, if you want to go and take a look at the entire study and read through it, it'd be a good idea. But he had over 3,000 patients poured into his practice with over 2,000 of them variably vaccinated. So anywhere from 1 to 40 vaccines, okay? They were predominantly all breastfed. Again, really good group to study. This is what he didn't expect to see, was that in the partially vaccinated group, which is orange, you had an increase over things like eczema and anemia and eye disorders and urticaria and dermatitis and asthma and allergic rhinitis and breathing issues, respiratory infection, ADHD, through the roof, behavioral issues, okay, ear infections. Classic that they started seeing, that right after vaccination would be ear infection after ear infection. Well, after this doctor published this study, the state of Oregon pulled his license and he wasn't allowed to practice just for publishing the study. The conclusion of his study, which I find incredibly reasonable, was, hey, this looks like there might be a problem. We should do more studies. That was it. It was, we see a possible correlation, let's do more research. They took his license away for this. And he only just recently, this was in 2020, he only recently got it back on the condition that he's not allowed to talk about vaccines anymore. So, Now the rest of the studies that I'm going to fly through, there's over 70 slides that I could show you, but I'd love for you to go to the website yourself and look at it, childrenshealthdefense.com. And these are the other vaccinated versus unvaccinated studies that have been done, sprinkled out across the whole world, actually, some of them out of Africa. So, starting with hepatitis B, you see an increased risk in autism, sleep disorders, speech disorders, neurodevelopmental disorders. This is unpublished data obtained from the CDC by FOIA. We've got a published study showing the odds for special education increasing 8 times. Male newborns increased odds of autism 3 times. In DTaP and tetanus vaccinations, an increase in allergies. We've got an increase in allergic rhinitis, allergies, ADHD, autism, eczema, learning disabilities, neurodevelopmental disorders. And this is a study in the U.S. of children 6 to 12 years old, vaccinated versus unvaccinated. You've got DTaP increasing mortality in girls in Africa 10 times. You've got vaccinated children having a 5.9 times greater risk of pneumonia and 3.8 greater risk of ear infections. This is more raw CDC data from FOIA showing the timing of them. Remember that doctor wanted to space them out and delay them. If you delay the MMR just past 36 months, you decrease the chance of autism of 3.6%. Same idea, if you delay the first 3 DTaP vaccines, you reduce asthma by 61%. If you choose not to vaccinate both MMR and DTaP simultaneously, then you decrease the death rate. Polio vaccine, they showed increase the type 1 diabetes in kids. Thimerosal is one of the key ingredients that you should look into. Aluminum would be another one, but thimerosal specifically in the hepatitis B vaccine has been linked to autism. Hepatitis B, same thing with thimerosal, but with emotional disturbances. Asthma with the HPV vaccine. Now that's one that kind of came out more in the last, just in the last 10 years. There's so much that I could say about HPV, and I'll show a little bit more in a bit, but celiac disease increased from HPV vaccine recipients, and pregnancy miscarriage with a flu shot. So I found all of this very shocking when I was pregnant and trying to make a decision about whether or not to vaccinate my own children. And as I said, the safety issue seemed obvious that there are risks, but what are the benefits? I wanted to know. They've done so much good, right? I need to know what's the other side of this. And, I wanted to look into the studies. So I find this one has been a pretty funny meme over the last year, but I feel like it's pretty true about some of the other ones when you actually dive into them. Let's start with measles. So measles, natural immunity versus vaccine immunity. When you look at natural immunity with measles, you get lifelong immunity. It's 100% effective. It is passed through breast milk onto the infants, and because it's lifelong, it protects the elderly. So you are protecting the 2 most vulnerable groups, infants and elderly. In vaccine immunity, you cannot vaccinate a baby until they're at least 2 years old. So now the infants are vulnerable. Vaccine does not pass through breast milk. The rates, if you look at the actual MMR package, says that they were able to test titers and get immunity antibodies for only 10 to 13 years. There are other studies that show up to 40 years. So now your elderly community is at risk unless they're getting their booster every 10 years. So this is kind of one of those unintended consequences of a vaccine that's 95% effective. So that was interesting to me. Another thing that I thought was very interesting in my studies was finding out that the death rate for measles had dropped significantly long before measles vaccine was ever introduced. In fact, whooping cough, diphtheria, scarlet fever, and typhoid also reduced the death rate long before the vaccines were introduced. Scarlet fever and typhoid had no vaccines. So I thought that was really strange. Why is it that we can attribute that the death rate decreased from the vaccine? Maybe not. I don't know that we can. Something, if you go to the CDC website, that I really wanted to dig into was that death rate of measles, because I was just so convinced it was a killer. How many of you had chickenpox as a kid? Okay, same. How about measles? Okay, from when I talk with my parents, they speak of measles very similarly to chickenpox. But how is that the case if the death rate is 1 to 2 per thousand, like the CDC says? Well, Well, if you go to this exact same slide, but you just keep going through the CDC's website, they actually tell you that close to 500,000 cases are reported, but there's actually 3 to 4 million cases that actually happen. This is data manipulation, right? 400 to 500 deaths per 500,000 reported cases. Sure, that's 1 to 2 per thousand. But what about for the 3 to 4 million? Looks more like 0.00016. That's a significant data manipulation to make it sound like something is far more deadly than it is. So I wasn't 100% convinced that measles was going to kill my children, and neither were the Brady Bunch or several of the kids' books back in the 70s. So my fear was alleviated for skipping the MMR, and I wanted to look at polio. Now, polio is an interesting one. There's a couple of different sources that I've looked into. I'm going to share a couple of factoids. I'd love for you to just think for yourself and decide for yourself. But one last thing on the measles that I wanted to share that I do think is a little bit interesting. 75% of measles cases tested by PCR are not the wild measles. They're actually from the vaccine strain. 5% of vaccine recipients develop a rash and a fever, which is indistinguishable from measles. And you remember that California outbreak? There was a good chunk of those people who had just been recently vaccinated. And it even says that in the study that in 2015 in the United States, 73 of the 194 measles cases were the vaccine strain. So measles is never going to go away if you keep using this vaccine. It just won't. It just looks different, right? Risks and benefits. Also, I think it's interesting that the most common side effect is the exact thing you're trying to avoid. Very strange. So, polio. I can't read it on this screen, so I'm going to read it out loud to you guys, and I'm so sorry. So, in severe cases of polio, fewer than 2% of people who contract it actually become paralyzed. I didn't know that. I thought that polio was basically diagnosed off of paralysis. I didn't realize that the majority of polio cases were actually not even paralysis. All I saw were those big iron lung photos, which I'll show you in a minute. Another fact that I thought was very interesting, it's all from CDC website. Polio is usually spread from fecal-oral routes, so really poor sanitation, and also has a vaccine strain. In fact, in 2019 and 2000 to 2019, there have been far more cases of the vaccine strain than of the wild strain. Anybody remember the breakout in Philippines, 2018, 2019, in that area? Okay, well, from a news article that I was reading that I thought was very interesting, they say it is caused by the vaccine-derived polio type 2 virus. It's the vaccine strain, and it spreads because of the poor sanitation and hygiene in the Philippines, but the solution is to still get the vaccine. That didn't make any sense to me. I was getting really confused by all of this. And then the last one of the graphs, so the same idea with scarlet fever, diphtheria, whooping cough, measles, and typhoid. Polio death also went down long before the vaccine. It's very strange. So do vaccines save lives? I don't know. I'm looking at the data and I'm feeling confused. Here are those iron lungs. I thought that this was real. CDC website says this was staged for a film.
What?
Ridiculous.
Notice you will not see, this is literally copy and pasted from the CDC's website. First glance, this image shocks and saddens from the enormity of the problem of sick children in need of iron lungs, but on closer examination, it's clear that the equipment that usually accompanies people using iron lungs, such as tracheotomy tubes and pumps and tank-side tables, are not present. This was for a film. But it's still used today to invoke the same emotion of fear. Now, people always say you don't want to see the iron lung come back. Well, you're right, I don't, but medical advancements have made it so that we aren't going to see it come back, and here's why. It never went away. I want to introduce someone. This brings a lot of emotion for me because over the last 8 years of researching, I have met so many families who experienced a vaccine injury close to home, either personally or with one of their children, and hearing their stories is very impactful. I'm not going to show you thousands of stories, but I am going to show you one. This was Colton Barrett, and at age 13, he was incredibly active, really enjoyed motocross, and his doctor at age 13 said it's time for you to get the HPV vaccine, and he said, well, I'm not sexually active, and the doctor said, well, someday you are going to have a wife, and you don't want her to get sick. So he agreed, and 2 weeks later, he started feeling pain in his spine and in his neck, and it turned into paralysis. Now, he was diagnosed with something called, and it's blurry on the screen, so I'm going to pull it over here, transverse myelitis. Transverse myelitis, if you look on the CDC's website, is indistinguishable from polio and indistinguishable from Guillain-Barré syndrome. And if you look at the symptoms of it, it's also indistinguishable from aseptic meningitis. The only way that you can distinguish these is if you run the actual tests to verify that. But usually these things are diagnosed off of symptoms. So I don't know if polio went away or if it's been renamed. There's really good arguments for it. It's worth looking into. But the iron lung didn't go anywhere. We have these wonderful permanent tracheotomy type devices called intubation. And I say he was Colton Barrett because this was permanent and he couldn't take it and he ended his life a couple of years ago. And a lot of people say he died by suicide. I say he was killed by a vaccine. This will be my last polio post, and I will just say that this doctor taught me a great deal. I watched hours and hours of her seminars before they were censored and pulled off of YouTube. Her book is phenomenal. If you really want to dive into the history of disease, measles and polio in particular, and smallpox, she really dives into it. She spent years reading the medical journals. She has over 800 peer-reviewed published studies in her books and graphs and charts that kind of paint more of a picture of the history of disease that looks a lot like what I saw this last 2 years with COVID, and is very consistent with that. One thing that she said is we still have just as much paralysis, if not more today, than we did back then. Lots of clever manipulation. Well, needless to say, after all of the research I did, I landed on some new things that I believed. I believe that vaccines have risks and they have benefits, and every individual needs to look into them and make a decision for themselves. I believe that vaccine injury is not rare. I just don't think we know what it looks like. I also believe that there are some people in power who are willing to deceive nations and look the other way as children are injured and hurt in order to stay in power. And I especially believe that after the last 2 years of watching COVID. Now, before COVID, there are a few things that me and some friends saw, and it kind of helped us to know what was coming, what was happening. Have any of you heard of Healthy People 2020 or the Healthy People Initiative? Okay, we got one. So this is HHS, CDC, stakeholders. These are different bureaucratic groups in the health industry that come together and they create a health plan for the nation. And in 2010, it was really cute. It was like, let's get everybody to exercise and eat well in America. Yay! Like, that sounds pretty decent. Well, in Healthy People 2020, it looked a lot more like, hey, let's vaccinate all the adults and have a plan about it, and let's get tracking, and let's have targets that we want to increase the vaccination rate by. Reach that 39 to 70%. How are we going to do it? We're going to increase the demand. How do you increase the demand? You create the need. Scary stuff. I remember looking at this and just being like, what in the world? What happened? Where are we moving towards as a nation? Before COVID, I saw that Argentina in 2018 had enacted a new vaccine policy. The adults had to be vaccinated fully in order to get a marriage license, a driver's license, a passport. Okay? I was like, that's scary. I saw articles coming out about how the government wanted to start tracking the unvaccinated. This is back in 2015. Guess what? In 2019, we have digital identity in Austin, Texas. ID 2020 in the homeless population through a vaccine. It was here before COVID. This was like not news to me when COVID hit. Before COVID, California removed religious exemption for childhood vaccinations. So did New York. The parents of California I'd become friends with on social media at this point, and I watched them as they went to the Capitol and they screamed and shouted because they were taking away medical exemption as well. They made it so that doctors cannot write a medical exemption unless the child, according to their bureaucratic board of health, if their child had an anaphylactic shock to every vaccine. How many vaccines? 16. Can you imagine watching your son or daughter go through 16 episodes of anaphylactic shock before a doctor's allowed to write a medical exemption? I don't think so. These parents were pissed. Excuse my French. Well, before COVID, we also saw that in New York, when the measles outbreak happened, the New York Supreme Court made it so the Amish could not get religious exemption for their 24-person Amish school. They made it so that 26,000 kids in New York were going to be kicked out of school if they didn't get the vaccine. They had to leave public buildings. They had to show proof of vaccine before they could go anywhere. The mayor said that religious exemption from vaccination does not exist. And parents caught would get 6 months in jail and $500 fine. This was all before COVID. I saw as journalists painted us to be monsters and dehumanized us and called us anti-vaxxers because we made personal choices and we spread some misinformation, telling us that we should have our kids taken away, re-education camps, property seized. All of this was coming. And then when I saw the Nashville Health Department start urging the state to remove our religious exemption, I got active. That is when I went to Washington, D.C. I met with Lamar Alexander. I met with the staffers of Marshall Blackburn's office. I wrote letters. I met with my representative, John Ray Clemens. I met with Jeff Yarbrough. I met with staffers at the mayor's office. I showed up to First Tuesday events where Bill Lee was speaking so that I could go to these people and say, look, you need to protect my religious freedom because I see that they're coming for it and I've seen it everywhere and I want to sound the alarm. Now, I got together with a bunch of really awesome people, and we did this together, and it was super cool, and we actually made some strides, and we got smart about it. So what's like the one religious exemption reason that most people use these days? It's the use of aborted fetal tissue in vaccines. So we got one of our legislators to sponsor a bill that would force the Department of Health to put the excipient list on our website so that everyone would be able to see which vaccines have those aborted baby fetuses tissue in there. Because that's a big issue for people. And having that conversation in the House committee and in the Senate committee hearings was amazing. So I want to show you guys a video, and just to get a little preface to it. The whole topic of aborted babies and vaccines had been broached once before, and you can see Lisa Piercy's response to it as she clearly tries to avoid the real question. And then you'll see the video that we presented to our House committee that got it passed in the House committee. And then you'll see the video that I showed, you'll see the response that happened in the Senate committee when we also got it passed in the Senate committee. And then the video that we never got to show because session stopped because COVID happened.
Let's see budget here.
Here's the volume. How do we fix the volume?
Yeah, volume up.
Dear friends. It's plugged into the HDMI. Is there volume on this? All right, cool.
There's been quite a bit of emails come across claiming that some of the patients are using stem cells from aborted fetuses in their development and research to propagate that vaccination. Do you have any insight to that, or is that trying to debunk something's happening in my district, and I'm trying to get the root cause.
So in case you didn't catch it, he said aborted baby stem cells. He didn't know, but he didn't know that it's not stem
There's been
cells.
quite a bit of emails claiming that some of the vaccinations are using stem cells from aborted fetuses in their development and the research to propagate that vaccination. Do you have any insight to that, or is that I'm trying to debunk something's happening in my district, and I'm trying to get the root cause, and I was just going to see if you had anything to speak to that.
Please let me be the first to thank you for trying to debunk myths related to vaccines. We certainly come across a lot of those, and we know how important childhood immunizations are. I'll ask Dr. McDowell to comment on
Stem cells.
Yes, to me.
Lee skipped over the vaccine. The aborted baby.
Stem cell research is a great thing, but it's not to get vaccine. Is that presently, has that been done in the past, decades ago, it made that propagated rumor.
I'm unaware of any, and stem cell researches are relatively new phenomenon.
It was 2019, correct?
Stanley Plotkin, MD, the world's prominent vaccinologist who discovered the rubella, rabies, rotavirus, and cytomegalovirus vaccine, known as the godfather of vaccines.
What are MRC5 cells? They are human fibroblast cell strain.
And how were they created?
They were created by taking fecal tissue and from a particular fetus that was aborted by maternal choice.
So, this study involved 74 fetuses, correct?
76.
76. And these fetuses were 12, 3 months or older when aborted, correct?
Yes.
And these were all normally developed fetuses, correct?
Yes.
Some of the pieces of the fetuses were cherry gland that was chopped up into pieces to be okay. Included the lung of the fetuses.
Yes.
Okay. Included skin.
Yes.
Kidney.
Yes.
Spleen.
Yes.
Heart.
Yes.
I'm the medical director of the state's immunization program. Vaccines do not contain aborted fetal cells. They do not contain aborted fetal cells. And there are no other cell strains for vaccine manufacturing that have been created since the development of these cell lines in the 1960s. And although the video here is meant to suggest that this is an ongoing process, it is not.
Paul A. Offit, MD, American pediatrician specializing in infectious diseases, vaccines, immunology, and virology, co-inventor of the rotavirus vaccine.
Hi, my name is Paul Offit. I'm talking to you today from the Vaccine Education Center at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. And one issue, and it tends to be a little contentious, is are fetal cells used to make vaccines? The answer is yes. Is there, residual or very small quantities of trace DNA from those original abortions in the vaccines that I just mentioned? The answer is yes.
This is what we wanted on the website for everyone to be able to see.
This study, published in April of 2019, goes about measuring the amount of aborted fetal material in the MMRV vaccine. They found that the presence of fetal DNA is confirmed in large quantities, 325 times higher than the maximum amount allotted by the FDA. They also found that it was not just DNA fragments, but a fully intact genome of a male human being. This peer-reviewed article, published in 2015, is searching for a replacement for WI38 and MRC5 due to diminishing supply. It's extremely hard to obtain these tissues. They needed 9 fetuses to find Walbach's 2. She was aborted at 3 months via the waterbed method, meaning she was born alive. Her name is Walbach's 2.
So we never got to show the very last clip because COVID happened, but I don't know how many of you were able to hear it, but the amount of DNA present in these vaccines that they were studying was 325 times higher than the safe amount according to the FDA, and that it wasn't just fragments, it was a full genome of a male human being, okay? Now, something that you'll notice when you look at vaccine package inserts is they have never been tested for carcinogenicity. They've never been tested for how they impact gene manipulation and mutation. They have never been tested for fertility and sterility impact. However, all of the ingredients in there have, and all of them do. So it's a very, very slippery slope and an interesting situation. What I learned in those Senate committee hearings was just how corrupt our health department is. They're willing to just lie straight to the faces of our representatives in order to prevent the public from knowing the truth about the aborted fetuses used in vaccines. because they know that we'll use religious exemption. Well, COVID happened and everything shut down, and I waited 2 weeks. And when Governor Lee came on with his live update that we were going to go another 2 weeks, and that until there's a vaccine, social distancing is a way of life for Tennesseans, I said nope, and got together with a bunch of friends. And we had thousands of people across the state. I'm just curious, was anybody at any of our rallies, the free TN rallies? Awesome, thank you guys for showing up. So we were parked outside the Capitol a couple times. We had people in Johnson City and Chattanooga and Memphis, surprisingly. And Knoxville, and my friend here. We tried to get rid of the mayor.
Yes, we gotta get rid of the mayor.
It was the mayor. And that is how I got plugged into all of these really awesome groups. Well, now I want to focus on what's happening next. So you know my story, you know why I got to where I was, how I got into this position of fighting for all of this kind of stuff. But the fight isn't over. How many of you thought it would be over after the election? Like, truly. Okay. How many of you still think that maybe it's going to die down? Okay, good, you guys are my people. It's not dying down, and here's why. Healthy People 2030 is on the books. You can go to the website, and I really encourage you to. It's a living document, meaning that they're constantly updating it with their objectives, and there are a couple that really give me some pause and some red flags, and I want to share those few with you. The first of which is this. They want to increase the proportion of adolescents who get the HPV vaccine. Okay, that's the one that ended up that kid with the tracheotomy. Sorry for that. They want to increase it 32%, meaning 5.4 million kids each year. How do they want to do that? They want to vaccinate the kids in the schools.
No.
Yep. How are they going to make that happen? Consistency. Maintaining consistency with laws. What laws would let them do that? Your mature minor doctrine. Where is that already happening? New York, California, Tennessee. We have our own. Under the age of 7, there's no capacity. But as soon as you're 7 years old, your capacity to make that decision, your physician should lean that you don't until you're 14, but they don't have to. We have no laws that protect them like that. And Michelle Fiskus, the one who said there's no aborted fetuses in these vaccines, who got fired over revealing this little law and was told, be quiet, you're not supposed to share that with Tennesseans. Well, guess what? We got to know about it. And when you're interviewing people for who you're going to vote for, be sure to ask about this. Big deal. Another red flag. Oh, they want to come to your door. They want to knock on your door and they want to vaccinate you right there. Isn't that great? They've been wanting to do that since February of 2016. It hasn't gone away. I don't think it's going to go away. Jen Psaki just was the first one to be able to say it on TV. All right. The next one. They want to increase the records that they have of you, adults, for a lifetime. They want to track adult immunizations across your lifespan. That whole ID 2020, that's a real thing. The last one is subtle, okay? And I want to unpack this one a little bit and sit here for a second before we go to Q&A. I've been reading on all of the different goals and objectives that they have. One of their pages is exclusively about discrimination and about how someone who's experiencing discrimination can have all kinds of health problems, which is why it's a health concern for the nation. Now, they believe on this document that these are the categories that experience discrimination. Race and ethnic minorities, yep. Women, LGBTQ, yep. The elderly, yep. People with disabilities,
Oh, yeah.
What's missing?
Men.
Religion.
Oh, yeah.
They do not believe that you can be discriminated against for your religion. However, the only exemption we have from this COVID vaccination in all of them is a religious exemption. This, to me, is probably the deepest, darkest of all of the threats. And I think it's going to come down through public safety threats, such as vaccine, and I think it's going to come down through things like hate speech. I don't know, did anybody see the law in Canada recently about conversion therapy?
Congress.
Well, no, the conversion therapy law that changed. Okay,
Yeah.
so they
can't
just
speak
call
against it anymore.
conversion therapy.
Yeah.
But yeah, you can convince
You can go
someone
to jail.
not to be their biological gender, but you can't convince someone to stay their biological
Yeah,
gender.
you can go to jail now.
That's the new law. And you've got pastors up there who are genuinely concerned because they're like, how am I supposed to talk and read from the Bible without it being considered some sort of hate speech? Well, those are our friends to the north. We're not too far away.
In Finland, actually, people have already been
Yeah,
to prison for
I was
that.
getting ready to say Finland too. Yeah,
Yes.
Whole terrorists.
yeah.
No good.
It's not good at all. So this is all that I have packed in for this presentation. I would love to get some question and answer session if we have time of it. Enjoy my memes. These I actually collected from before COVID, but I feel like they're relevant now, so it's fun. Yes, agree.
So you had said that you were trying to protect us, and so that we would protect our religious freedom. To my understanding, I didn't know that we had religious exemption, and back then, it's still kind of foggy now.
Yeah, so the state of Tennessee, the way that we have our laws written is that you, for school vaccinations, can have religious exemption on the condition that there is not an immediate epidemic or a threat thereof. So with COVID, I don't know what they're going to define as a threat thereof. We've seen how they've reacted over the last 2 years. We'll see. But that's where our current laws are. There have been talks to remove it. There have been talks to add philosophical. There have been all kinds of talks.
There's 2 bills this year.
There are?
Yeah.
Oh, awesome. Be looking for that. Any other questions?
Tim, it seems like some other countries, like we've seen the UK and so forth recently, are dropping vaccine passports and a lot of the mask mandates and stuff. Have you seen or expect that to translate to the other nations, including here, or are we still going the wrong direction?
I think that too many people have too much invested and on the line for them to give up without a fight. So I don't think it's just going to go away on its own. I love seeing what the truckers are doing in Canada. I think that's great. But you've got to think about, we've got our military and our Navy who I'm watching as they're trying to get religious exemptions for themselves, and they're having to speak with chaplains and go through counseling, and they're still being rejected. You've got healthcare workers that can't make their own healthcare decisions. It's insane. I haven't seen enough of a fight from the United States to protect the United States to believe that we're going to do anything about it. But I think it starts locally. I think it starts with us.
So with all this data getting scrubbed and buried as deeply as possible, is there a good place that it is concentrated and people are compiling it together to save that data so that it's available?
Yes. These are my additional resources. These are some of the resources that I have been following for 8 years now. I like Children's Health Defense and I Can Decide and the Highwire. They give you every peer-reviewed published study for you to look at yourself. They don't tell you what to think, they tell you to think, which is great. They also interview some of the most fabulous people, and they've just been wonderful to follow. LearnTheRisk.org was founded by an ex-Pfizer or Merck? Was she Merck? Merck. An ex-Merck pharmacy employee, or pharmacist employee. Pharmaceutical employee. She blew the lid off of so much corruption, blew the whistle, and now she's dead, and it's very concerning as to how.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Who do you think she died with?
She was suicided.
Killed herself?
That's a great question. I don't think so. But she started LearnTheRisk.org, and she has a wonderful wealth of information and blows the lid off of Merck. Just the inserts.com is what it sounds like. They just want you to look at what the manufacturers have put out there and what the CDC has put out there and just kind of condense it into one spot. OpenVAERS.com updates constantly what the actual VAERS data is. If you go to the VAERS website, it's confusing to look at, but if you want to look up, deaths specifically or COVID vaccines specifically or anything like that, you can. OpenVAERS.com does it for you and does it all in one place. And then the book Dissolving Illusions by Dr. Suzanne Humphries, as I mentioned, is just phenomenal at looking at the history of disease. Another one would be the movies Vaxxed and Vaxxed 2. Watch them. They're controversial. If you haven't seen them, see them. Just think for yourself. Get a sense of what is out there and whether or not you believe these people. I remember we watched the movie Vaxxed 2, and it was when we were introduced to one of my favorite doctors in the whole state, and he came out after the movie watching thousands of kids being injured by the HPV vaccine, and he came out to talk about it. He has 8 children, and his first is fully vaccinated, and his last is fully unvaccinated, and he'll tell you the story of in between, and he's in Spring Hill. And he's had his license threatened by the state of Tennessee already, and he was at all of our rallies, he's spoken at events, and it was just, his message to me that I loved was be compassionate with doctors. Because can you imagine dedicating 20 years of your life, hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt, putting your livelihood and your entire stock in something, and then having to question whether or not you were responsible for injuring somebody, or whether or not what you were taught was even partially wrong, what that does to you. And then if you speak out, woo, you were called a quack, you were written off, you don't have it anymore. But if you don't speak out, then what? These doctors are in a really tough spot. And I think a lot of people saw that a lot with COVID, but it's been happening since before that. So, yeah.
I have a question. The doctor that you said that got his license threatened in Oregon, what is his name?
Tennessee?
No, in Oregon.
In Oregon?
Yeah.
Dr. Paul Thomas.
Okay, so I watched his channel, and I was watching it even when his license got in question. They took it. He went through that. It cut through his livelihood. So what started everything is that he operates a pediatrician office, and he was seeing that the vaccinated kids were getting a lot sicker than the unvaccinated kids. And so he started doing a study where he literally was using his own patients as the data that he compiled to compare the many times that kids that were vaccinated getting sick versus the ones that weren't vaccinated. And it was mind-blowing. And so because of that research that he put together and he published himself, and then he gave the information to the parents, not pushing anti-vax, but more of providing people with more knowledge to make better decisions, but not necessarily saying I am now an anti-vaxxer. He even says in his channel, I was never an anti-vaxxer. I just wanted to arm people with information so they can feel good about the decisions about whether the kids should be vaccinated or not. And so the Oregon board got a complaint about, he speaks about all of that, and I don't remember exactly but took the license, and he couldn't practice for almost a year.
Yeah.
He couldn't. He almost lost his livelihood and everything over because he wanted to simply educate people about the risk and the benefits of your child with being vaxxed or not vaxxed. So he's got a YouTube channel, and I highly recommend that you guys watch it.
Dr. Paul Thomas.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So there was recently like a whistleblower report that a couple of military had put out about the damage the military keeps on various health codes or whatever for different types of things, and there's that increasing. And then just now in the last few days, the Pentagon put out some kind of statement saying that the data just wasn't good. It's okay now. Do you know anything about that or have any insight on that?
I don't know anything about that. You said it was Pentagon and military database.
Yeah, so like it's basically like the military database where they just keep track of all the medical records in aggregate for all the military.
Yeah.
That there was a dramatic uptick, not just in myocarditis, but like a whole bunch of different health codes, coinciding not with COVID showing up, but with vaccines showing up. And they started to record the information they were pulling out of this database and eventually published a report. And then like the Pentagon went in and like changed the numbers and said, oh, well, there was, it's just a data error and we fixed it, and so don't read anything into it. But it's like a little bit, sort of a flimsy response.
I didn't catch it, sorry.
It's very recent. It's only in the last, I think, like year or so. That's starting to come.
So when you mentioned about like a little of the history in the 80s with Reagan passing that law, which gave the legal immunity basically with the vaccine corporations and stuff like that.
Yeah.
I had this kind of clicking moment where it's like that seemed to be the mark of a beginning of a war. From your experience and research, like what is your opinion on this war? Like what is the, like both sides, like in my sense, like I was thinking like a war from this collective against the humanity and stuff, but perhaps you might be able to have a more high definition opinion on this kind of big picture kind of
Sure.
thing.
Well, my personal opinion as a Bible-believing Christian is that we absolutely are at war. and that we are at war with something more than just men and government. And I read the book of Revelation, and I do believe that what's happening is part of the end times. That's my personal belief. I think that it's interesting that you use the word war. I remember started calling it the children's war when I started realizing how many kids were being injured and killed. And that's where I don't think that they're going to stop on their own. I think we stop them, or we don't.
Kim, one final question, and we've got to wrap up because the restaurant closes at 8. We could go all night. I think Kim will be around for a few minutes afterwards as well if you guys have questions. But what can we do to have the biggest impact on pushing back and fighting for medical freedom, especially in this COVID world we're in today?
I think that it is a matter of being completely unified on the issue, getting together with all of the other groups, and making sure that when you see legislation, red flag, you get people on board to get it to stop. You show up to the committee hearings, you pay attention to that legislation, and you also try and sponsor legislation that stops it. We need things in place to protect our religious freedom first and foremost, because that is, we are unique as a nation on that and almost that alone.